Right, welcome to our panel, having to do a lot with spot on diversity is the hashtag, I believe, that we have up here, possibly. And we're talking about kind of issues that we were just saying that we don't want to preach to the choir about some of the issues that we know are really prevalent in STEM when it comes to dealing with the lack of diversity in many of our fields. So I'll just quickly give a very brief introduction to everybody who's here up on the panel. I do want to note, this was not intended to be an all-female panel, but unfortunately Alex Bond, if you're familiar with him, he's extremely witty and fantastic. He's unable to make it today. So we're saying that this chair represents the male ally we want for all of us here. So my name is Michelle Jewell. I'm a zoologist by training. I research great white sharks, which is very much a masculine alpha type field. But now I am involved in scientific communication and also providing mentors to younger women who are interested in sciences, using sharks as kind of this cool thing to kind of keep the interest going, but also giving them the long-term mentorship that they need to keep going in STEM when they hit these various barriers that we all come across during this type of field. In no particular order, I also have going down the sheet that I have in front of me, Lillian Hunt. Of course, Lillian, she's here at the Francis Crick Institute, and she's chairing the LGBT plus staff network, Proud Crick, and she's going to talk more about that in a minute anyway. Badini Samar Singh, she is here working on molecular biology and cancer research. She founded STEM Women, and of course, celebrating women in STEM. We've been having a really good chat so far anyway about these various issues. And last but not least, we've got Isla Watton. She's coordinator for SoapBox Science, which I hope everybody here is familiar with SoapBox Science, surely. Really phenomenal organization. She's going to be talking a bit more about STEM issues and diversity there as well. So here we are. This is your panel. If you want to take it away with your introduction.
So, can everyone hear me? Okay. So you said you wanted us to do an origin story?
Yes,
about,
please.
How we got into this?
Yeah.
So in my case, I did an undergrad in molecular biology, then I did a PhD, then I did the route of the postdoc until I realized, I don't want to keep rebooting my life every 3 years. And I became an academic refugee because I left academia, and I now work for the Medical Research Council as a science writer. But in that journey of moving from research to science communication, I became very interested in seeing how few women were there at the top, and how leaky the pipeline got, and how many of us have alternate careers in science communication, impact communication, things like that. And it just made me interested, like, why is the system set up like that? And I started looking at things like that and reaching out to people, finding those stories, and that's sort of how I created the website stemwomen.net, where we share these stories. And I really want to highlight that people who leave academia, they're not puddles out of a leaky plumbing system. They're doing something, following their passion, and it's really important to acknowledge that they're not failed scientists, because being a scientist is a way of life, it's a way of thinking, and we carry that through with us throughout. So, go for it.
Just quickly on that last note about people leaving academia not being puddles, I heard a great quote earlier this week, I think it was at the Royal Society Diversity Conference, which is one person's puddle is another person's irrigation system. So just know that one. I'm Lily. I've just finished my PhD here at the Crick. I'm waiting my Viva, so I may or may not get a PhD.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Through my time here at the Crick, I have helped set up the Proud Crick LGBT+, we call it plus because it's wanting to be more inclusive than that, network. As we don't like the acronym, we're called Proud Crick. We've marched in Pride 2 years in a row, once individually and then once with a collaboration with GSK and Wellcome Trust. In addition to that, I've sat on the EDI committee here at the Crick, which is the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee. I think with all committees, you sit there and you talk about a lot of things and you try and get some actions done, but it is kind of an uphill struggle when it comes to things like EDI, because a lot of the time you're not getting the money that you really would want in order to act on these things. So off the back of that, we linked up with Welcome and GSK to see if we could create sort of a bigger impact, and I helped lead the EDIS symposium here in September. So that's the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in Science and Health Research Symposium. It was a brilliant day. We had, I think, around 350 people sort of came to that day, which was excellent. And then off the back of that, I've just secured funding from Welcome and GSK to now do that full time. So after my Viva, I'll be working with Welcome and GSK and hopefully still the CRIC to set it up as a network. So if you want to speak to me after this about sort of if you're part of any organisation that wants to be involved in that, we can see how we can link up. So I think it's really important. So origin stories, that's kind of the main thing. My PhD is in genetics. And I think one of the key things a lot of us who are involved in diversity and inclusion need to be honest and say, actually, the reason I got involved was purely selfish reasons. I'm gay, and I looked around and I thought, wow, where are the gay scientists? So I thought, well, I'm one. Maybe I can be that person for someone else. Or I go, where are the female scientists? Or where are the female in higher up levels? And I go, well, maybe I could be that person. Because that's what I was sort of missing in terms of who I was looking up to. And I think another thing that we also need to talk about is there are loads of small groups doing things in this area, and there are loads of people who are really motivated, and we need to try and link everyone up and sort of almost crowdsource the way that we approach this in terms of policy and strategy. So that's something I hope to do over the next year as well. So yeah, I guess that's the main sections from me.
Hi, I'm Isla, and I'm not an academic at all. I actually come from an arts background, specifically focused on how the audience interacts with performance and different kinds of art, and exciting ways that you can kind of get them involved, specifically through kind of interactive stuff. But somehow my journey, origin story, has led me to SoapBox Science, which is, if you don't know, it's an outreach initiative for women and non-binary scientists. So we've got two main aims. One of them is to highlight the work of women in science, and the other is to reach people in the public who wouldn't normally engage with science. So the people who don't have the time or the inclination or the money to go to their science museum or their science festival, or who study in academia or who haven't had the chance to study science at school. So the way we do this is at the moment, it's looking for 2018, like we'll probably be in about 36 cities in 7 countries around the world. And we take women scientists and put them on boxes in the street, quite literally. And they then chat to the public that pass by about their science. So it's kind of an unexpected interaction. And it's very low-key. There's no PowerPoint slide. They don't bring fancy props. It's all very hands-on and fun and aimed at children. So we want to try and inspire girls to get into science as well as boys by showing them these amazing real women who can be role models for them. And another key thing that we do is we have the blog on our website where we ask our women to write a blog about their personal experience. So at the moment, I think we've got nearly 250 contributions to this, and it kind of details their personal stories, so the origin stories we heard about earlier, which is really important because they talk about the issues that affect them specifically, and it can be anything. They can be women who've taken a break from academia and they've come back, or it can be women that struggle with mental health, or women who have disabilities, especially disabilities that aren't physical and visible disabilities. So they detail their stories and they talk about the problems that they've faced and ways that they've overcome them. And it's actually a really great resource. So if you definitely go online and have a look at the stories, because they're really inspiring, and chances are that there'll be someone just like you on there that talks about what they've faced.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So what the structure of this panel that we're going to be having now, we're going to be looking at the various issues, but not spend a lot of time on it. I mean, obviously you're in this room because you can recognize that there's an issue when it comes to diversity, otherwise you wouldn't be here. So we really want to focus on actionable stuff. What are things that we've seen that work? What are things that we've seen that absolutely are catastrophes? And why is that the situation? And then hopefully, if we've got enough time in the end, we can take some Q&A as well, and then we'll finish up with our 6 words or less idea that you can take to your own institute to help remedy some of these issues. So one of the things I was reading over the weekend was the Equality Challenge Unit's report on diversity in STEM. And what I pulled away from that, which is, again, kind of you intuitively know, but it's nice to have data to actually finally back these things up, is the people who are most subject to these challenges recognize them, whereas the community that doesn't have these challenges will say that those challenges don't exist in their own departments. So, for example, it was a massive survey. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. But in that survey, they asked various questions like, is your department doing enough about equality, yes or no? Or do you strongly agree with that, or do you not strongly agree with that? And very much so, the heterosexual white male would say that my department is doing it well, whereas everybody else is coming back saying it's not being done well in my department. And of course, these people are coming from the same departments who are taking the survey. So that type of dichotomy is kind of part of the big issue. So what do we take from there?
Yeah, this is a huge issue that we face at the CRIC. So we were trying to collect diversity data from everyone here at CRIC so that we could figure out what's going on in our own house. I'm not saying, just knowing numbers is enough, but it's a good place to start so you can measure improvement from things like that. And when you go to a strategy board or something, they're always like, well, where's the numbers, where's the graphs? We had people coming up to our stall where we were encouraging people to fill in the data, and someone going, well, I'm a white man, it doesn't affect me. Like, I don't need to put that data in. I'm thinking, well, if you don't, then it looks like the entire of the CRIC is black or ethnic minority, which is not true. So we need allies to get on board. In the same way, someone asked, why should you even bother having an LGBT network when, everyone should just be treated the same, everyone should be exactly equal. And I had to turn around and say, well, I've grown up and, I've seen legal changes during my lifetime, which I know that people in senior positions may not have always agreed with because they've come from, an earlier generation before it became sort of cultural norms. And I just want to know that it's okay. Before I came to the CRIC, I was like, well, oh God, how am I going to tell my supervisor I'm gay? Is he going to be okay with that? So having the allies and having the people to understand that actually we need them as much as they need us, because they do, is really important. And I think it's convincing someone that there's a difference is just something that we're doing all the time now because of knowing your privilege. And it's starting to come out slowly and it's starting to come out surely now. But for every man in this room right now, if you are in an organization that has an Athena Swan or a Women in Science panel, please join it. Please join it, because we need men on those panels as well. And that's a really important thing. And the same for BAME networks and LGBT networks and disability networks. We need people who don't necessarily identify as those groups, but can be there to be the supportive voice. It's horrible to say, but sometimes actually an older white senior dude speaking on your behalf can make things change a lot quicker than when you're trying to shout from the bottom.
I'd like to add something to your point about having these allies join these panels. One caveat I would like to say is when you join these panels as an ally, so if you are a white person joining an ethnic minority group, or if you are a heterosexual person joining an LGBT group, please make sure not to hijack that narrative and make it about you. This is not about you being a performative ally. Hey, look at me, I'm such a great ally. Look at all the wonderful things I've done. Don't do that. Just be there. Listen and support, because I cannot say enough how many times I've seen performative allies just literally take the mic and hijack the conversation. Don't do that.
Yeah, definitely. You can keep that one.
No, I just wanted to add quickly that we've actually, in SoapBox, been really lucky that we've got a lot of men that help out with the events. We've got men who are the lead organisers for cities and have decided that they think it's valuable. And I think from working with lots of different departments across universities, those people are there, and I don't know if they're the majority or if they're the minority, but I think praise them as well for the work that they're doing, and really, they're quite unsung heroes, at least in the work that we do, because they are not the ones stood on the soapboxes, but really, we can't really do it without them.
So kind of addressing as well, why do you think that there are so few allies in a lot of these meetings, a lot of these talks, apart from the ones who just want to show up and hijack it, which is an issue. But is it, speaking from my field, when we were trying to set up a equality board in South Africa when I was working there, it was kind of viewed that if I were in a position of power, I would almost be taken less seriously, or somehow my career, I would look a little bit weaker if I joined one of these panels, or you kind of check in your card at the elite boys club kind of goes away when you start to incorporate yourself into these discussions. And I'm wondering, is that something that you've seen in your fields as well, or what other kind of challenges you can think of that might be keeping people from wanting to go to these discussions, to want to be here?
I'm a little bit guessing at the moment, but I feel like if it's not an issue that affects you personally, so I'm kind of imagining now or thinking about talking to my male friends in my department, I feel like they don't necessarily want to go to those spaces, partly because they don't feel it's for them, and also because they have completely good intentions, but I don't know if they feel comfortable speaking up about things because it doesn't seem as important as hearing it from the people who are experiencing it. So I guess making sure that we make sure that they are welcome and that it is a conversation for them as well and worth it.
Yeah, I guess it comes back around to, like I said at the beginning, we get involved in these things from the grassroots level because of selfish reasons. We do it because we know that if we're passionate about it, it's probably because it's affecting us directly. So giving that motivation to someone when it doesn't affect them directly in their eyes is kind of a difficult transition to make. What I will say is, in addition to that grassroots, ground-up sort of level of impact, it is really important to try and get that change from the top down at the same time. There's been plenty of studies that have been shown. There's the McKinsey Diversity Matters 2 report coming out in January I've seen some of the data from. And just having one female board member drastically increases the number of women that are transitioning from that lower sort of management level to a senior management level, or returning to work after taking time out for a pregnancy, for example. It's kind of a dramatic or drastic thing to say to a board of directors or something like that, add a woman, and they're going to say, well, what if the person's better than the man? But actually, that sort of change isn't that dramatic and it isn't that drastic. And sometimes you can just add, these people in, and it doesn't have to be tokenistic. But the effect that something as simple as that can have has now been shown. We now have the numbers for it, which is something we were missing a couple of years ago. So in addition to having that grassroots level, we really need to start actioning from the top down at the same time.
You asked how do we get more allies, and why do we have fewer allies, barring the performative allies? I think privilege is one of the things. And I think it's also important to understand what unconscious bias is. And this is where you can have an actionable difference, because if you have unconscious bias training for scientific panels, that works. If you have unconscious bias training for hiring panels, that works. So make sure that your organization implements things like that. I worked at an organization before where the peer review panels did not have unconscious bias training, because one of the senior people who worked there was like, no, we don't need that, because we just give money to the best applicants. It doesn't matter if they're men or women. But that's not how it works, because unconscious bias is a thing, and we like to think that science is this pure, emotionless, logical thing, and the best will always rise to the top. But we forget that science is practiced by humans, and humans are a product of cultural norms, and we absorb millennia of these biases, and we need to actively combat that.
Definitely, yeah. So coming back to what we were saying about effect from the top down as well, and getting those people to the table, how do we get there? Because right now we have, again, it was in the ECU report as well, that and stats that we all know, in my field in zoology, I would say 60% of the PhDs working in behavioral ecology with sharks are female. But it's completely dominated by male professors, male tenure track, male this, male that. And we've seen in all sorts of different reports, no matter where you look, that there's really good representation in PhD, there's pretty good representation in postdoc, and then it's just gone after that. How do we fix that? The hard-hitting questions.
Yeah, this is the big one, isn't it? So at the EDIS symposium, there was Professor Jim Smith was here, and he asked a very similar question, and he basically turned around and was like, "Do you need to sack me?" And no, we don't need to sack people, especially not Jim, who's an excellent ally. Yeah. But we also can't just wait for these people at the top to effectively retire. That's not a way of doing it. So one of the things that we're thinking about asking for is some sort of structural change to the management system, because you've only got so many people in place in that top level already. But for example, I know over at Wellcome, there's a direct line coming down out of Jeremy Farrar, and I think then to Ed Whiting, who's Director of Policy there. And suddenly they realised that there was not a single female that was directly reporting up there. So how are any of those women going to ever make that leap upwards if they're not in that sort of branch? So do you need to then restructure the way that people are reporting to people and give those opportunities for promotion, which might not be there with the way that things are currently structured? So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it, from sort of postdoc to PI level. I know when we were at the National Institute of Medical Research before we turned into CRIC, and I think the policies come over, is basically any woman who is applying for a lab leader role who fits the criteria will be interviewed. And it's a basic criteria, they fit it, they get interviewed. That's as simple as that, and that's if only just to increase the numbers of women that are in that pool to start with. It's really difficult in science when you're recruiting to be unbiased, because you cannot anonymize CVs because of academic papers and because of the research. And if someone says, "Oh, I'm involved in this and I was at this university," well, you pretty much know who they are. So it's a very difficult thing to do. But what you can do is set those criteria where if you meet those set 5 criteria, it doesn't matter what they are, if, for example, they're a female or if they're BAME, and that's something that you definitely know that you are somehow biasing against in your recruitment process currently, you can make those changes, because that doesn't count as positive discrimination. That's more of a positive action, and there's a real clear distinction between those two things.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's a really big issue, and there's no kind of one magic fix that's going to sort it all out and suddenly there'll be loads of representation for everybody. But I think it's this is why things like Athena Swan are so important, because they make you look at the organisation as a whole and all the different things that can affect the reasons why women, first of all, don't get promoted or why they drop out of science completely. And we have this big knowledge gap in STEM subjects at the moment anyway, where we need all these skilled workers. So a really easy way to combat that would be to keep the women who are being forced out of science. And it's not just because they have children, it's because of things like unconscious bias, it's because contracts aren't stable, so it's harder to support a family, and unfortunately that usually falls on women more than men. And it's all manner of things. So I think things like Athena Swan are really important for departments, because it really makes you look at how are they structuring their kind of social schedule. Does it impact people who don't drink? You know, this kind of snobbery, the kind of lads groups, and things like that. So it's good to kind of keep a really broad view and also talk to your staff, see the issues that affect them, because chances are if you've got something that's kind of hindered one person, if you then add it to all of the other issues, it could, you know, result in certain types of people, because, you know, women aren't just this big mass that's all the same. So issues that affect one type of woman might affect a different type of woman completely differently when it's added with other things. So I think, unfortunately, it's a really big web of issues that all need to be addressed.
Can I just add on the back of that with the Athena Swan thing? So David Rubain gave us a talk from the Equality Challenge Unit, and he was saying, when the funders decided that you needed Athena Swan to get funding, overnight the increase of subscriptions to Athena Swan was ridiculous. They couldn't handle the amount of inflow. So a decision like that coming from above suddenly all of those universities and all those research councils, research centres could have gone for Athena Swan 2-3 years prior to that. They could have potentially had things in place already, but they didn't do it until they were told that they had to. And it's horrible to say, but you need someone to say, you need to do this in order for it to happen. So a big impact like that, I think, is really important.
There's also something to be said about why women leak out of the pipeline. And we talk about, career choices versus family life. We talk about, after postdoc level, getting that first permanent tenured position is really hard when you have kids and things like that. But there's also something to be said about the environment of academia being really unpleasant. And in the wake of all the sexual harassment stories that are coming out, that's a little bit of the elephant in the room. It's not just Harvey Weinstein, it's everywhere. Oh, yeah. And women have been talking about this issue for so long. I don't know why suddenly there's a cultural shift where we suddenly start hearing about it in the news now, but none of this was news to me. None of this surprises me. And we really need to listen to women more when they talk about this. And also, how do we make it such that if, for example, you were harassed or bullied, why should it be you who has to be your biggest advocate? How do we make sure that you have allies around you who do that work for you, who challenge the people in power who have been bullying you? Because it's too much for one person to shoulder that burden, and it's just easier to leave. And how do we find those stories? How do we bring those women and minorities back? And how do we redress that balance? Yeah. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think, which segues very nicely into my next point, fantastic. But there becomes, when you encounter any sort of challenge, and whether that's a woman who's been harassed, whether that's been somebody who's been harassed for their sexuality, whether that's been somebody who's harassed because of their minority, oftentimes you will run into a situation where you have to make the decision that I need to do something about this, and it may really negatively impact my career. And in my personal example, a PhD that I left, that is still kind of this black mark on my CV that I have to explain. And that becomes really, really difficult. Even now, but the position I'm in now is fantastic, and they all knew the story as well. But for that whole application process of going after job after job after job that that 80 other people just qualified as you are in there as well, you hit these kind of situations where people say, well, what happened to this PhD project? And how do you address that as well? So it's not just harassment necessarily or sexual harassment, but any type of situation like that becomes your burden to take forward, whereas the person who's actually responsible for that is still supervising students, for example. So how do we address those issues? And further from just women issues, because here we are, all women sat here talking about it, but with all the other minority situations involved as well, how do we really tackle that burden that you end up with?
I mean, we were just in the other section before, and it was talking about mentoring and about having multiple mentors, so that if something were to go wrong, for example, with one, maybe your primary supervisor, you've got other people to lean on. Please remember as well, these characteristics that we're talking about, the reasons why things might go wrong, for example, with sexual harassment, things like that, they're protected characteristics. If something is wrong because of the way someone is reacting to either your sexuality or your gender identity, disability, all of those things, they are protected characteristics, and it needs to be known that that is not acceptable by law. If something were to be said, by law, you are in the right position, and the onus should never be on the person who doesn't have the power in that situation because of some reason from above. And I think it's really important to create these supportive networks, both within workplaces such as BAME networks, LGBTQIA, so that people, when something like this happens, it doesn't blow up and it doesn't become something that's damaging later on in their life. It can be dealt with there and then, and they know that they've got the support around it. If you're ever questioning why there should be a women's network or a BAME network or a disability network, it's for reasons like this, so that you have a safe space for people if something goes wrong, so that they don't just leave it and they don't walk away from the situation upset still, and with it still being a negative thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. Definitely it should you know, if it's a legal issue, like there should be a lot of things in place to protect people. And institutions really need to take a responsibility for these kind of things that happen, because it should never be that person's fault, and it should never be a situation where it will then affect their career. So I think institutions really do need to take a look at how they address problems like this. So if someone comes and reports any issue, that they have really strong structures in place, really strong contact points that people can go to, where they know they'll be believed, where they know they'll be listened to, whatever the problem may be, no matter how small it is. Just so these things don't all add up and become these really big issues that are really detrimental to one person.
We can't have BuzzFeed reporting about it
Right.
before the university does something about it.
Yeah, definitely. No, this is the world we live in now, right? This is incredible. No, when the whole Harvey Weinstein thing was coming to light, I remember some of my friends not laughing, but we were kind of joking about the fact that it's horrible. I mean, these stories are absolutely horrible. And when you're working in a field, or when you're working in a really tight-knit community, when you're working in a lab all night long, and you're working with a Harvey Weinstein, you know, that can become a really intimidating space. Or if you're working with somebody who you absolutely know is a racist, and you have to tackle that as well. How do you go about getting those people out of the pipeline, rather than all the rest of the people who are having to suffer for it?
Yeah, actually, just wanted to share a quick personal story. I was at a conference in Cancun earlier this year, and I think it was the last night of the conference. And there was a guy there, and he was a supervisor, he was a PI in America, and he was a creep. And it's as simple as that. He was a creep, and people were talking about it and whispering about it while we were at the conference. A couple of the girls were saying, oh, he's a bit weird. When we were at drinks last night, he was just a bit weird and next to us. Obviously, the last night of the conference, people have a couple of wines, people are a bit more relaxed. And he sat next to me, and he stroked my back, and I told him no, and I moved away, and he did it again. And at that moment, I got up, and I was like, all right, I'm going to bed. And I walked off to the lifts. I turned around at the lifts, walked straight back over with a bit of Dutch courage, and called him out in front of everyone. Yeah, exactly. And can I just say, I have never felt so proud of myself apart from that moment. And I've done a lot of things where I've walked away, and you think of those things in your head, and you don't say them. If you have the confidence to say it, if you take that one shot of tequila and you feel better about yourself, and you say those things, you don't have to live with that sort of for the rest of your life. And I think the reason I said those things back to it was because of a lot of the stuff that was kicking off in the media about people being honest and open about these situations. And that, I think, speaks in itself. If you are honest and open about these situations, the Me Too campaign, people talking about it for the first time in their lives maybe, that's going to only drive other people to feel more confident and to talk about it as well. If you get to a point where you're okay with what's happened in your life and you're okay with sharing those stories, you can be a role model. Whether you feel like you are a role model or not, just by sharing it, you become one. And then hopefully someone after that, and the chain reaction happens, and someone else is going to stand up to that creep at a conference. And I believe he's never going to be invited back to that conference again. So it works. You just have to share the confidence and share the courage, I think, amongst people.
So, moving forward, we've all been involved in these various fields for quite some time, seen systems that work, seen systems that absolutely do not work. What would you say has been one of the kind of highlight systems that you've seen, wherever that may have been, that really tackles what we've been talking about, these issues at the moment?
I think that at an institutional level, there are systems in place, but they don't always work because often the chain of command reports back to someone in power, and sometimes that person is the creep.
Yeah.
So what do you do then?
Yeah.
And this is where these networks, some people call them whisper networks, they work. And it doesn't necessarily have to be you talk to your immediate colleagues. If you can, that's great. But you can also find other people who have dealt with similar experiences. So you had a creepy professor, how did you report that? And things like that. I think finding out how did others deal with it, getting that support for you, looking after yourself through that process, because it's horrible to go through, that's really important. have friends who believe you and support you and trust you, and you have to look after yourself first. And that's, you can't set yourself on fire to fix the system. You have to look after yourself first.
There's kind of two things that I think are really good methods here. One, we talked a lot about power and power imbalances. So flip it on its head. So this is where I know GSK have done it, reverse diverse mentoring. So specifically, not just reverse mentoring in terms of leadership, reverse diverse mentoring. So talking to a group of maybe 8 individuals who all have different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different gender identities, things like that, and the management level speaking to them on an honest and open forum. It's a safe space. Debate is fair. It can be a group. It can be one-on-one. But it's really, really worked. Another thing, the caveat of that is the self-selection a lot of the time. So you end up with people who are already interested in that and not necessarily the people who really need it being selected. So that's something they're working on. And then the other thing was, I was at the London conference this week, and there was someone talking about crowdsourcing policy. So basically, they were talking about when staff members of sort of big conglomerates, something happens to them, the management says, well, that's not our fault because of this policy. And then there's a way, for them, this example was there was an app where basically you could speak to other employees, see if the same thing had happened, and then slowly you gather a number of, say, maybe 500 case samples where the exact same things happened. And then when you go to management, they have to listen. And a similar idea here, if you are in an institution or you're in a minority group, your numbers are limited within your institution. But if you then connect with other people who are in the same situation in other institutes, suddenly your sample size as a scientist grows significantly, and you can actually get significant difference, which is really important.
Okay, just to really quickly say, I would say it would...
Much bigger audience.
Yeah. Well, 2 things mainly. One would be to make sure that you have really strong networks of people that can support you, and make sure the institutions put those networks in place as well, so everyone can share stories and the issues are actually talked about openly. And the other thing would be to spend more time looking at how you reach those communities and people who are missing from science anyway, and how do we encourage them to become part of the scientific community.
I've got no time for questions, obviously, but we did spend a time preparing our 6 words or less. Okay, fantastic. Few questions actually are completely allowed. So, and any burning questions within you you'd like to address? We go.
Oh, I will be the first one. Thank you.
Go on.
Is it working all right?
I can't hear you very well now. I can give you mine.
I missed the first part. I wanted to come to this. I had a problem when I was coming from there because there is that house and there is a lot of problems going on around. And I know that place because I live very close to here. So because I live close, I've been working with this building, beautiful building that we are using now. But this session is about academic community. One of the issues I wanted you, if you could clarify, what do you mean by academic community? Because I work with the community, and I would like really to be considered in this research and in all sorts of jobs that are coming for this institution, the Creek institution, or any science, any institution that deals with science. Before it was opened, many people did apply, but not many were lucky really. Yeah. Now, more than ever, people from the local ethnic minority community need to be considered. And so I would like if you can give me a positive response on my community. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, bearing in mind I'm here at the Crick, I know that one of the caveats, well, not caveats, one of the promises that we made when we built this building here was that we were going to engage with the local community.
I forgot to give my name. I am Helia Evans.
Hiya. Yeah, so we have to engage with the local community. You can't just plonk a shiny new building in an area and hope that it will work. You need to react with the community and ask them what their needs were, hence why we have the community centre out the back, which is a space that we don't even have priority or using a tool at the cricket is for the local community. So that's one thing that is really important. In terms of your question about who is in the academic community, we got to remember when we do science, it's not just about the scientists, it's about who the science affects, and that needs to kind of be included under that umbrella for sure. When you're doing, for example, health research, if your cohort that you're looking at is all male, then you're missing out on some of the differences that could be between male and female. If your cohort is between one ethnic diversity group, I know, for example, in my genetic research, I use quite closed-off ethnic minority groups in order to make my research easier and simpler, but I know that I would therefore be missing a lot of data from other groups. So when you're thinking about these things, you've got to think about who the science is affecting, and you've got to include those in the communities that you're approaching and that you are being involved with, in addition to communicating health research outcomes or changes in medical health research outcomes to different community groups as well. And I think that's really important. So although you might not necessarily define someone as an academic, they're still involved in the academic science that's going on.
Hi, just a quick comment on who your allies are, I guess. Coming from my own experience as a researcher, I was working for a public body that had a lot of women actually up at board level, a lot of women in science workshops going on, a lot of activity. And then when I got pregnant with my first child, what I found was those women don't represent me. They were women who I got called aside into an office one day, and one of the very senior women said to me, "I really think it's a mistake. You want to take a year off." You know, with my daughter, I took 3 weeks. I think if you want to succeed, that's what you need to do. And I think we need to be careful where we're just trying to get women onto a board, because I think actually we need a diverse group. And actually I found most of my allies in senior male white board members whose wives had taken the time off because they were the main earners. The women at the top were not like me. They weren't representative of me.
We were literally just talking about this growing up before the panel actually started. So, and what I kind of attribute this to is the system that's in place now, especially in my field. In order to achieve that spot at the table, you get selected for. There are certain traits that get selected for if you're a woman and you want to be up there. That oftentimes I didn't relate, to that type. And when you're seeking a mentor, you are very alone, because the assumption is if they're female and you're female, they're going to be your ally, and that's totally wrong.
Yeah, that's it.
The female, and it goes all throughout. You could have really great non-disabled. We were talking about disabilities as well. People who are going to be a better ally to you than somebody who may have, a visible disability. So that's key too. It's not just the outward appearance, not the book cover, as we like to say.
No.
It's really the content of what that person's actually going to do.
That's right. And I think, so my other point is now I work for a really, really non-diverse group. We're a very small organisation, there are only 4 of us. We're all women of childbearing age with small children, because we all work part-time and we all work from home and we do our research. I'm an epidemiologist, so I'm doing data analysis. It can be done at home. Yeah. And now we're working for a small not-for-profit. We all work part-time. We all juggle it with our children. And for me right now, it's just really refreshing to see those opportunities beginning to open up.
Yeah, just quickly on that note, I just want to give a shout out to the Daphne Jackson Trust, who've been giving some brilliant funds to women who are taking some time out for various reasons and then coming back into academia. That plus flexible working needs to not be seen as a privilege, but it's actually a right. So people need to do that as well if they're going to be thinking about things like parental leave.
6 words or less, how do we fix it?
At the risk of sounding sarcastic, I don't think change will happen through sound bites.
There you go.
This is a really small point. Don't use red-green immunofluorescent slides. Yes. People are red-green colourblind in science. It's a small change, but it makes a big difference.
Mine basically echoes stuff that's been said already, but your story matters, so share it.
Yeah, definitely.